what are you going to do? Your default was something popped in my mind, stimulus happened, I responded by smoking a cigarette or whatever. Mm-hmm. So that happens now. How can I kind of catch myself, think about it, maybe have a list of some better coping strategies and start to break that pattern?
Hello, I'd like to welcome you to our recovery podcast, and I'm Pastor Brian. I'm the recovery pastor here at Christ Church, and we are hosting a All Things Recovery podcast where we talk about recovery in the whole, not just specifics, but everything and all things recovery. And today I'm joined up with Dr. Neal Gray for a follow-up conversation from our previous podcast, and he's been so gracious to come back. And we're going to expand on what we discussed the last time. But Neal, just take a minute and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and what you do each and every day.
I'm a counselor educator at Lenoir Rhyne University, and I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor. And I've got a history of working with addictions in my past. Most currently, last year, I worked in a school, did some practice in a local school also. So, and again, I think they are trying to prepare younger people for the obstacles they'll face in life. Hopefully they won't turn to alcohol and drugs. So, and before we started, I just wanted to give a content warning.
Oh, absolutely. Go ahead.
Just in preparation for what we're going to talk about today. This podcast is going to contain discussion of substance usage. We're going to have discussion including potential triggers for individuals that are associated with usage and addiction. This topic may be difficult for some individuals. So we just wanted to put that out there so you can thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And on our previous episode, we spent some time talking about an actual definition of what recovery is, really from a clinical side. And I'm just going to kind of recap that. But the definition is recovery is a process of change through which people improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and strive to reach their full potential. And that's the National Institute of Drug Abuse's definition. And they go on a little bit, but being in recovery is when those positive changes and values become part of a voluntarily adopted lifestyle.
That's good.
Recovery requires strategies for handling negative feelings and live a contributive life. So we covered this last time, but recovery is a process. So it's not going to happen overnight. It's we do recovery one day at a time, which is what we say at every meeting. But what I kind of want to open with as we dive into what we're going to talk about today, but you hear this a lot, folks that are, don't know quite as much or don't have quite as much experience in recovery. The first thing they hear is, why don't you just quit? Mm-hmm. Just quit and all will be well. And it's a little more involved in that, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah. I think that's, Neal, just stop drinking. Just, quit buying cigarettes. Quit going to those websites. So that's an individual sometimes for people in recovery. This is the atmosphere environment of feedback you'd get from individuals. And again, you said it right at the beginning, it's a process. It's going to take a while. So I think at some point there's support group for families. I know we talked about that. That was great in the last two podcasts. Those ones that really love you and care about you and are going to be supportive to your recovery, it'd be great if they could get some education on this. Mm-hmm. And I even think sometimes in the church, it was, well, Neal, just read your Bible more, pray more. And those aren't bad. I'm not saying that. Yeah. But you don't need recovery. Just do that more. Mm-hmm. But, I think everything we talked about, these are conversations that come up with people that can deter your recovery. them not understanding.
Yeah, and I think that's when someone's saying that with well-meaning intentions, they indirectly, not knowingly, could discourage someone in recovery because they're thinking, well, they're telling me all I got to do is just stop, but I can't stop just like that. It's something's amiss here. And I think what we're going to discuss today would bring some light to actually have some understanding for those in recovery, but also the family of someone in recovery. And unbeknownst, they may be, this word we're going to talk about today, they may be the trigger that is causing someone to just continue down that road or fall into relapse. They may not intend to be, but they might not fully understand what triggers are, and there's different types of triggers, and there's things that just happen that cause us to fall back in or relapse or continue down that road. So I think it's valuable today because what we're going to talk about today is actually triggers. So how they impact those in recovery, but also I think folks that are supporting those in recovery need to have an understanding of what triggers are and what effect they have on those in recovery. And hopefully I think that would do a lot to pull away from that, we'll just quit statement. So Neal, just starting out, could you give like a definition of what a trigger is?
Yeah. I can't remember what reference I got this from, but it was a textbook. So anything, you heard me say anything?
Anything.
That brings back thoughts or feelings or memories of the addiction.
Anything.
Thoughts or feelings or memories of the addiction. And what can happen, it can lead to cravings, and that's that intense desire, like to use the substance, that urge.
So the anything could be a place, a particular place, a particular smell, a particular person, or particular TV program, or anything. Anything is anything. So is it important to, how important is it to early on to, as you're working your recovery and fully committed to it, to be able to identify what those triggers are?
Yeah. I think it's very important, and I think it would be great. I'm a big proponent of counseling. That if you would, get across from somebody and start to do some of this work to be able to start to identify these, and maybe some psychoeducation around more in depth than what we're going to do today, where you're like working through a workbook too. Yeah. What are your triggers? Kind of like where life's almost a laboratory experience from week to week, where you can start to discern what those triggers are and what you need to either, that you can't change. So we'll talk about this later. You can't change, so you got to be aware of it, and how do you adjust, or you just have to move away from these. Yeah.
So the basic thing is, if you're struggling with an alcohol addiction, you don't need to be going to the bar because that would create the problem. And so identifying that, what's the benefit of, and we mentioned, share groups, 12 steps, and getting in a share group. How can you utilize a share group to help identify some triggers for those that, can't get counseling or just isn't available to them? How can a share group benefit that?
Yeah, I think other individuals that have some clean time or have made these life changes talk about what they struggled with. And in that relation, there's a commonality among human beings. Yeah. And I think learning what has helped other people in their recovery, like where, we talk, it's the big terminology used in AA and in celebrate recovery, people, places, and things. And just what have other people done in those situations? And then maybe with a sponsor, accountability partner, and group, You ask for advice from somebody. I mean, what's worked for you and hasn't worked for you? So, we talked about those seemingly unimportant decisions, or it's not always that boulder. What it would say was those grains of sand. Starting to figure out what that is in your recovery. Because we're moving towards this new spiritual lifestyle. We're changing our lifestyle. We're going down a different road. We're going to have to engage in different behaviors. We're going to have to be around different people, different places. There's some things that we had before that have to change at this point in our lives.
Yeah, and I think that's, Paul tells us in Romans chapter 12, it's like verse 1 and 2, but change the way you think. We must change the way we think. And if we've been thinking non-recovery related things for a long time, for us to start thinking about things recovery, we actually have to change the way we think, change the way we see things. And what you have seen for a long time is not being a trigger, because it's been what you're practicing and what's been accepted. But then you get in a share group and somebody says, well, hey, wait a minute, let me just share what I encountered today. Not telling you what to do, but this is where I was with that. That is huge. And that's kind of like what we're talking about, I think, is what is actually one of the triggers, but an environmental trigger. Because we mentioned, like smells and, a particular place. Is there, and that's the people, places, and things.
Can I start with people?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I know we've got there's something in therapy called motivational interviewing, and it's a evidence-based strategy with working with individuals, drug and alcohol problems, and all addictions. But one thing we do in that's a lot of Socratic dialogue, and that's just way conversations occur. And you will ask, like if I was counseling a client, I ask them, because you want an honest discussion, what's holding you back from recovery? And, how many times have I heard somebody say, Neal, everybody I know uses. So with people, it could be your family. I mean, I remember I was doing something, I don't know if it's the university I'm at now or where I was at before, and we were doing something with a dietetics program. And so I asked them, when they were working with people to have healthier diets, one thing that would really pop up, some of the individuals would say, well, my husband, my son, they expect me to cook this way. So it was hard for them. They might have high cholesterol or diabetes, but it was hard for them to change because other people expected them to cook that way. And then that was triggering for them, cravings for those types of foods. I know that's off topic. But
that's
yeah, people are, I would say that's a big one. And that's why, again, you want to get them in AA and with us, Celebrate Recovery, to get relationships with individuals that are going down the same road as you, because life's about people. And so I'd say that is really a tough one, just to change people. And, and I hate to jump in, and I'm not saying somebody's got to think about this right away, but I've seen people leave jobs because after work, everybody would go out and drink or do other things. I mean, this was in the 90s, I was doing drug and alcohol counseling in Cincinnati, and I had somebody move there from LA for a certain reason because they needed to change their environment. And they said, let's move across the country.
Yeah.
My recovery, being clean, my sobriety, that's another word I haven't used today, sobriety is so important to me, I'm going to do whatever. And I think that's, if you have a partner or spouse that uses alcohol and you're moving away from alcohol, you're going to have to really have a conversation with them about keeping a 12-pack in the fridge.
Yeah.
It's just tough, these discussions. But I think counselors can help with that, and your sponsor can probably help with that. But I would think right away, starting to think just because we talk about it at CR every week, what are those people, what are those places, what are those things? And I don't know, maybe you think about Thanksgiving, Christmas, you still got to go over there, but maybe doing some preparation work before you go for how that's going to look versus when they start bringing the wine out.
Yeah. And that's what you mentioned there. I'd like us to come back to at the end a little bit, but some of the preparation work and checking in. But, what would some of the examples of like an emotional trigger be?
Well, and I think I wrote something down thinking about myself. When I introduce myself, one of the things I bring up, Neal, I'm a grateful believer, is anxiety. Mm-hmm. So I can be triggered by uncertainty when things are out of my control. So not having control, if I'm not able to solve a problem or fix it. One of my terms is I hurry and worry, trying to fix something. So I think a feeling of anxiety could be an emotion. Depression. Mm-hmm. And a friend of mine in recovery uses these three: sad, mad, glad. Mm-hmm. And he said he cannot go mad. He's got to call somebody right away, because if he goes mad, he starts going into a dark place. Yeah. But sad, for him, I'm not saying sad's great, but as he's gotten, regulated emotions better over the years, he can be sad. Mm-hmm. But you got to know where your and talk about if glad moves into this hyper excitement, that could be a trigger. So I think when we talk, I'm glad you started with emotions, because if we've got individuals that have been, I hate to keep going back to drug and alcohol because I think this can fit with everything. Yeah. But if I've been using 20 or 25 years, it may take me some time to really learn what it means to feel sad. Yeah. Because I've always stuffed it down with drugs or alcohol or anger or depression. It may be even just somebody looking at a feelings chart and saying, hey, this is happy. When are you happy? Tell me times you're happy. Mm-hmm. Tell me times when you're sad. Because it might be somebody who's like, well, I'm noticing when I feel this way, and I start to stuff it down with drugs or alcohol. But I think the other thing with emotions is to just kind of sit with your body. How do those emotions feel in your body? Mm-hmm. Like if I'm getting mad, my heart may start to palpitate or something like that. But to better understand how your body reacts, so then you can engage in a better coping strategy than turn into whatever it is. Compulsive shopping. Yeah. Looking at pornography. So.
Yeah. And that's, and you mentioned, stress and anxiety. That's two big things in recovery. And then you mentioned that other word that starts with a C, and it's control. And that's one thing in recovery is we are surrendering control, at least is what we talk about in our Celebrate Recovery, is you surrender your control to Christ's care and control. You surrender that control that you held on to where you were trying to play God for a long time. You surrender that over to Christ. But in that's a huge thing, because there's going to be a lot of anxiety and stress in that, because you're going to be where you're used to controlling everything and trying to make all these pieces of the puzzle fit together and do all this and weave everything together. You've got to turn all that over, and you got to lay that down. And that is where those daily things come up. Exactly. When the little thing comes up that triggers that stress or anxiety, something, I don't know, the car breaks down or something, and it just creates your kids or something. It could be anything, but it just sends that anxiety through the roof. And because you're beginning to live sober and learn how to live sober, that comes up in a way that you've never had to deal with before, because whatever our coping mechanism is for whatever hurt, habit, and hang up we got, that's where we always went to suppress that. So the emotional trigger is one that, I personally see a lot and have a lot of conversation with folks about, just because that is like every day in your face before you, and it just shows up. It's not even anything you go looking for. It's just going through daily life. But that also leads, the behavioral triggers take it a little deeper, don't they? And that involves like routines and habits.
Yeah.
What do you have on those?
Yeah, you kind of mentioned it there. So changing your, even one way to change our thinking is to do things different. What are routines and habits? So if I've had if I've got a trigger, it turns into a craving. What I've done before is grabbed a bottle or shopped or looked at something I shouldn't look at. Maybe it's that fighting that thinking with a change in your behavior of going to a meeting, calling a sponsor, doing something different. How we experience life too. Maybe it's going out and I was going to talk about this later, but doing some breathing. Mm-hmm. But it's got to be, we said a little bit in the first podcast, and everybody knows this definition of insanity. If I want things to be different, I can't do the same things over and over again. Mm-hmm. So you've got to do something different. And I think whether it be with a counselor, developing a relapse prevention program, or working with a sponsor on that, what are you going to do? Your default was something popped in my mind, stimulus happened, I responded by smoking a cigarette or whatever. Mm-hmm. So that happens now. How can I kind of catch myself, think about it, maybe have a list of some better coping strategies and start to break that pattern of those routines? So, it is hard to break routines. Yeah. We're routine people. But you've got to break them.
Yeah, and I think this last one you mentioned, we were talking about behavioral there, but the last one is psychological triggers, and I think you mentioned kind of that with that, but it's the negative thoughts that enter our head, and one way that we talk about, putting a tool in our toolbox for those negative thoughts or those things that show up that want to distract us, but it's actually a gratitude list. You make the gratitude list on the spot. When the negative thought enters, I can't do this, all is going wrong, that is where you take the pause when, the anxiety shows up, the stress shows up, there's something happened that's in your routine or your habit that's been upside down, and then those negative thoughts begin to enter. I'm just not worthy. I'm just going to go back to where I was. None of this is working. That is where you make that gratitude list for that moment, that day, and for that situation you're in. How valuable is gratitude to offsetting a negative thought?
Well, I think it goes back to what you said with that Romans 12:2, changing the way we think. Mm-hmm. And I led one of the share groups Friday night, and at the end, we had a little time. I said, let's everybody go around and say 2 or 3 things you're grateful for. Because I know even from my own recovery, I can assess myself that I'm not in a good place when I'm not thankful. When I'm not thankful and I have gratitude, when I feel entitled about things, I'm rushing to get things done, I can even assess myself that I'm not in a good spot. So I think that's a real key. Again, I talk about, and he's spoken at our, Brent had him speak at the prison a few weeks ago, but a neighbor of mine who's a real leader in the Hickory recovery community, he's 90. I was talking to him about gratitude one time, and it's basic, and it was Neal getting up in the morning. I mean, he even said going to the bathroom. I mean, it was these basic things that he was thankful for. And that may be where we need to start with gratitude. But I think if you can make a list of gratitude, of things you're grateful for, and look at that. Because sometimes I think, even in our own, when our thinking goes awry, when we're real struggling with a problem, maybe other things aren't going to help it. We got to change the way we think about it. And a gratitude list is just being real basic about things we're thankful for, and I don't know the verse or the book in the Bible, but isn't it clothes on your body and a roof over your head to be thankful for? I don't know where that comes from, but I've read that, I think.
So gratitude is like, step one for checking in on the triggers, establishing, being grateful in that moment before the negative thought enters, which leads to the negative action that, obviously won't be beneficial to our recovery. And that's where I like to add in I mention this to folks a lot, but ask the question, is this beneficial to your recovery? Does this support your recovery? Yes or no? And that's pretty much the answer. If it's yes, okay, that's something you can dive into. If it's no, it's something you need to leave alone. But triggers obviously are going to happen each and every day. They're not going to go away, and they're going to be there forever. So what?
But hopefully it'll get easier over time.
Well, what makes that easier is establishing the toolbox that we like to say for recovery, knowing how to navigate this particular trigger when it comes up. Say, okay, this didn't work real good the last time, but when I pulled the gratitude list out of the toolbox and I started making my list, I could see where things were clicking, and I was able to make it. And then you mentioned, like, when you can't make a gratitude list, you really are, that's how you kind of gauge your recovery. So what's some of the other things that we can use when triggers come up to help offset them or change the negative thoughts into positive thoughts and to relieve the stress and the anxiety when we get put in the wrong situation, person, places, or things, which that's not always in our control. Sometimes things just happen, but we make that little momentary decision, and this is something I use, but a momentary lapse of judgment can create a lifelong decision. So that momentary lapse in judgment can create something that carries through a lifetime unless you fully embrace it and get into recovery. But what's some of the tools that we can use to help combat these triggers?
And I think at first you talked about it. I think back to being a process, awareness and being able to recognize these. It may not happen overnight because you've been involved with these over so many years, and maybe as you better understand your body and how emotions play out, and you can make different decisions. So, and then because you're making that decision, am I going to avoid this trigger? And you're going to either talk to your sponsor about that or a therapist or whoever, accountability part. Am I going to avoid it, or do I begin to manage it in a healthy way?
Yeah.
Is it something that I can't get away from? And I thought, what we talked about, because we're talking about manage them now too. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Self-care. How do we cope with difficult emotions? I know I'm a HALT person: hungry, angry, lonely, tired.
Oh, so you get hangry?
Yeah. So I get, and I think CR does that heart check. I didn't.
Either one of them, but hungry, angry.
Yeah. So I kind of know myself, and then I can but I mess up sometimes, and I look back, and it's like, but I knew it was there. And I think the longer I've been on this road, almost like I know I've got an older car, every 2,500 miles, I got to get the oil changed. Mm-hmm. I know when something pops up that I can be more preventive with it now than I could be in the past. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So I think that's it. But you got to get on this road to recovery to start to learn that stuff one day at a time. And I think, talk about a little bit today. If we start with our thinking, now there's different schools of how this looks, but a lot of times we think of thinking leads to feelings, which we talked about, emotions, to behaviors. Mm-hmm. So if we can move away from like catastrophizing, that if something goes wrong, it's like, this is the end. I'm done. And then, we start to feel a certain way and we start to drink, or all or nothing, real black and white thinking. Mm-hmm. So if we can start to show ourselves some grace in our thinking, and maybe, It's feeding ourselves scripture, praying. How can we be in the moment, be a little more mindful of our days? A guy I worked with, I just love what he said. He didn't invent this, but he says we got to move from anxiously reacting to lovingly responding.
Oh, wow.
And I just think that's real powerful. How can I move that way? And in the moment, how can I catch myself to be able to internally ask that question you ask people? Is it good for your recovery or not? And it may be, here's another addiction. You're a people pleaser.
Yeah.
You may have to set up a relapse prevention plan where you say, when anybody asks me something, you say, and you read it, I'm interested in this, but can I get back to you tomorrow?
Yeah.
And that may be something you just have to do. So, but I think those are some strategies. And let me see what else I had here. Did you want to ask a question while I'm looking?
Yeah, I mean, that was, I think we covered that, but you mentioned the creating a plan, a relapse prevention plan. I like that. As far as that means you've got to put some forward thought into preparing for the situation where the triggers come up and have it spelled out. So, okay, this takes time, especially in recovery when you're doing this, but you got to and when the situation comes up, you've got to ask yourself, what I learned from this to put it in play for the next time. So how to prepare for that. But I mean, I think it's important for everybody to understand it's got to be to that level. It's got to be almost spelled out on paper. This is how I'm going to react when this situation comes up. That way you've thought about it beforehand, and you're not making that split judgment at that time. Wait a minute, I've got a plan for this. I've got a procedure for when this happens, and there it is. So, and I think that's to the level that you've got to get to in recovery to make these changes and actually through that process of change.
And if you do relapse, we don't want you to relapse. But if you do, how can we make it as educational as possible? So maybe having somebody journal. I'd journal about that. So I could look back at that when that comes up before and start to think about what could have happened differently. Yeah. What do I need?
What did you learn from it?
Like, yeah.
I like that. So anything else you want to add on triggers there?
Well, used like journaling, self-reflecting. I've got this, I tell you, this is a CR. I don't know where the camera's at, but I got this through CR. It's a daily inventory workbook. So maybe you're going to learn yourself doing this, going over this. How am I feeling today? What did I do right today? It's, personal inventory. What did I do wrong today? Yeah. Do I need to make an amends? How will I do it? And so this is real. I think this will be helpful because sometimes they don't say the relapse just happens in the moment. What was going on the week or the year before?
Yeah, it builds up.
And if you can use some type of tool, and I just like to journal. Some of you may not be journal people, but that really helps me with self-care. But I put that, and then I just even we talked about it before, just a real detailed trigger diary. Who, what, when, and where.
A trigger diary. Who, what, when, and where. Okay.
To reduce and then of course I talked about, talking to a sponsor, accountability partner, group, counselor. I didn't even think about this, pastor. Maybe talking to a pastor about things too. But I just think it's cathartic. It's good to get stuff out and talk to people and what you're struggling with. And as you start to go down this new road, I think it's good to get things out and learn new strategies for change.
What would be a good, as we kind of tie this up here, what would be a good gauge for somebody, because we certainly want them to get connected to a share group, a 12-step group. What would be a good thing for someone to realize that they need to take it to the next step and maybe seek out a counselor? Because there's some things that are just, we like to say, too personal for a share group to where you share with your sponsor or someone else. But also there's some things that do require the next level of care with a counselor or someone of that nature, a specialist. What would be, just to kind of give somebody a 10,000-foot view of what would be some of the things you need to look for to take that step to begin seeking that out, and have some folks kind of help you navigate that. Not everybody needs that. Most people, a share group does tremendous work, and I think even counselors encourage folks to get connected to a share group in addition to counseling. But what would be some of the things that somebody would kind of put on paper and say, well, maybe I need to take this to the next level?
And again, of course, I'm real pro counseling doing it.
Oh, yeah.
For me, I talk about like going to the gym.
Yeah.
That really, but I think things that are really debilitating with anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, ideation, and, history of trauma. Mm-hmm. So I think, we really didn't get into it, but I do think there's good medications for anxiety and depression too. Mm-hmm. So that's something that I think it's positive to talk to a counselor. I just think as many positive, or therapists, as many positive voices you can hear. Mm-hmm. So it's just another outlet. And, some individuals are going to be mandated to go to treatment too, but I just think even that relapse prevention plan, if you went for a few sessions to do that. So I think it could be really, the things I named are, those, but even if you wanted a session or two just to process how things are going in your recovery outside of your recovery environment. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. And that speaks to one other thing that I think maybe we can just pull everything together here. But you have got to put effort into your recovery. Nobody can do it for you. And you've got to take some ownership on it. And I think that's huge there in what you said is you've got to maybe check in with somebody else to evaluate how you're doing to get an honest opinion back. It's okay, this looks good, and I think you're making great strides, but maybe work on this a little bit to get some honest feedback. But we got to own our own recoveries, don't we?
Yeah.
So
now, it is. I wanted to say two things to that. Rachel, that first podcast, they had to drive, but they found a CR to go to. Mm-hmm. That was a major commitment, life change commitment. The other thing I wanted to say back to counseling is, if you're going in recovery and you're making changes, I still think there can, maybe not right away, but at some point there could be some benefits for your loved ones to get counseling or some type of family counseling to occur too. Yeah, so you all understand each other. And that would probably be that would be benefit. It can also be done at CR2, just like Rachel and her parents were in different groups. But I think counseling can really benefit that too. Like an Al-Anon group for
and that gives the
family members.
The family members that, as we open with, why don't you just quit? Why don't you just stop? And all will be good. That family member may not totally understand what they're saying in that, and don't understand where the person is, but getting connected to that does help bring that a little more into focus. Like, okay, it's a little harder than what I'm saying here, and I don't really understand everything, but I am beginning to understand where you are. So that kind of bridges that gap a little bit of some real probably frustration and anger that sometimes family members face because it's just not working, it's just not happening. So they naturally get mad at the person, thinking, granted, they've got to own some stuff. They got to own a lot of stuff to get walking in recovery, but it's just more to it than just quitting. So I think that's the value of folks coming together as a family. It helps everyone understand.
And I us keep talking about counseling. I was thinking about just the way we communicate. We really, like I talked to you about being at that elementary school, we were really working on the kids with being assertive versus passive and aggressive, how we communicate. And I just think there's so many life skills that can be gained. So I just think the two can really go hand in hand. And if you could see somebody at some point, if you think it's necessary, I don't see any negatives with it.
Yeah. And you've counseled a lot of folks, and you've sat in a lot of share groups, and you've taught a lot of new counselors in class. And I think I'm safe in saying that if someone just shows up once a week or once a month and comes and just sits in the chair and listens and maybe talks a little bit and then gets up and walks out and makes absolutely no changes and come back the following week, the counseling is not going to work. And you're essentially kind of wasting your time and wasting the counselor's time. So there's ownership in recovery. And is there any encouragement that you can share or words that would encourage someone to get connected in that, but also know that they've got to take some walks on their own, and they've got to own their recovery.
I think to what you said at the first, I mean, I can't remember. I used to say this to people, how many hours there were in a week. Are there 160 some or 7? If you're just doing 1 hour a week work when you're with your counselor, or you're doing 3 hours a week going to CR and not doing anything outside of there, it's not gonna be as beneficial as if you start a lifestyle. I mean, this is a lifestyle. And I don't mean that it can be scary at first, but I think the longer people are in it, they're like, I'm so thankful for this lifestyle change. And I think just about the serenity prayer and having serenity in your life, and probably the longer you're in recovery to pray that prayer, it's just a life-giving prayer. Because that's what we want. We want more peace in our life. I mean, we want those obsessive thinking to leave us, the compulsive behaviors, and just to have some serenity in our lives. So I think it's a lifestyle. But if you come to CR, the great thing is there's other people leading that lifestyle. So it's an open club to anybody, which I think is great. Yeah. And then you're going to be very different than everybody else, but you're all on that same road. Yeah, so I just think that's why I'm just very thankful for Celebrate Recovery, and that there is a Celebrate Recovery in Hickory. And
that's I think that leads to a good spot, and I think I'll close with a serenity prayer today, and because this just really ties into where we are, but it does share that it closes with being reasonably happy, and that there's an assurance there that things aren't always going to be 100%, but we're shooting for that. So I'm going to close with that. Neal, thank you for being with us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
We will probably have some more future sessions together, but thank you for taking the time. And I'm going to close us with the serenity prayer today. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace. Taking as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. And have a great week, and thank you for joining us.